You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome back to the program. We're, of course, very excited to have Ambassador Francis Rooney, who, he has been the ambassador to the Holy See. He's got a wonderful book that we had discussed with him. I believe it was the last day of the year, and it's called The Global Vatican. Very interesting, and of course he's got such great experiences that he's had and some of the things we've discussed before and that we will pick up again today. Ambassador, since we've last spoken, we have two very interesting things that I'd like to discuss with you. And the first being that the President's meeting with the Pope, and also the Secretary of State John Kerry meeting with the Secretary of the Vatican. And, two very interesting things when we look at world affairs, the direction that things have been going. When you look at Eastern Europe and when you look at the Middle East and Africa and throughout Asia, there are a lot of, I would consider to be very hot spots. And I'd love to get your take on, first these two meetings and also where the Vatican and the Pope would be on some of these issues that we're reading about every day in the news.
Sure. Well, it's a good sign that after 6 years of attenuated, cold relations and really lack of interest in the Holy See's diplomacy on the part of the Obama administration, that Secretary Kerry went over and made that trip, and that the President did. And I think, there are a lot of people saying, it was one person's trying to use the other and all that, and there's always an element of that in these diplomatic visits. But the fact is the President met with the Pope, and I think that hopefully he'll realize the benefits of engaging the Holy See in its global diplomatic outreach. And so I'm pretty optimistic about it, actually.
Well, that's very good. And did you get any feedback on this meeting? What were the general topics that were discussed? Or I'm not sure if you.
Yeah, it was classic Vatican ceremonial diplomacy. They wanted to make sure the meeting was going to be a success. So the hard subjects and the blocking and tackling was done with Secretary Kerry and Cardinal Parolin, who is the Secretary of State of the Vatican, when he came a few months earlier. And then the day before the Pope and the President met, Cardinal Burke issued a diatribe against the Obama administration's life policies and the insurance mandate and the confrontation of the insurance mandate and the First Amendment, which is to set the tone, And then after the Pope and the President met, Cardinal Parolin met with the President, and he reiterated some of the same points that he'd made with Secretary Kerry. So it's classic Vatican diplomacy. The Secretary of State does the blocking and tackling and the Pope didn't have to get into that too deeply, although I think you can see from the photos and from the press release from the Vatican that the Pope played it pretty close to the vest.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was very interesting. And I think that this Pope has taken a different tact, if you will, with the way he's been going about, addressing some of the issues that are important to him and of course, now important to the Vatican. And it seems to me that he's trying to represent different areas of people or different parts of the world, which maybe he feels have been underrepresented to some extent. So I'd like your comment on that. Then I want to revisit something that you've discussed at great length in your book, which I think is so relevant to what's going on today.
Well, first about the Pope, of course he's looking at things differently because he, like us, is from the New World. And for the first time since Jesus, we have a Pope from the Western Hemisphere, and his view of things is radically different. That's why he's able to look at the curial reform and the reform of the Vatican Bank with such clean eyes. And I think he's going to add a lot of value in debunking a lot of myths over there that have been able to persist because of the collegiality among the Italian curia. The other thing is, he comes from Latin America, and one of the worst examples in all of Latin America for corrupt government, crony capitalism, and inequality of wealth is Argentina. There's no safety net there. So when he speaks about social justice, he's speaking about it from a much more radical platform than the United States. I know the president wants to make it look like, hey, we're all brothers, we're all talking about the same thing. The fact is, and the Pope made this clear, the difficulties of inequality of wealth and corrupt capitalism in Latin America are radically different than what we face, thankfully, in the United States.
No, that's a very good point. And, when I was reviewing your book the first time, I was actually reminded that the Catholic Church was really, I guess, at odds with the conflict in Iraq and some of the, I guess, steps that the United States was taking in their war on terrorism. And that was very interesting. And now here we are, when we look at today, we're at a point where we've completely removed ourselves from Iraq, and we're in a process of withdrawing from Afghanistan. And we really don't, because of Ahmed Karzai and what's going on there, we don't have anything in place for us to leave troops at this point. Now, that may change. But do you think that perhaps the Catholic Church had seen something that maybe we weren't looking at, or maybe they were looking at something a little more objectively or in a different manner? And does the Holy See or the Catholic Church view their opinion that they had back then, would it be similar, or do you think that maybe they've changed and we've changed somewhat as well?
Well, okay, in the first Iraq invasion, then there was limited scope, not nation building, basically go in there and drive Saddam Hussein back into Iraq and stop. The Vatican was all for that, okay?
Yes.
But the second Iraq invasion, when we went in there to try to change, to try to basically create a new nation, the Vatican was against it for three basic reasons, all of which turned out to be correct in one form or fashion. One, they said, you're going to radically increase the persecution of Christians. Two, you're going to radically increase the violence and level of conflict in the Sunni Shiite civil war. Well, that happened too. And then three, they said, you're going to do for Iran and the Shiites what they haven't been able to do for themselves in a 10-year war against Iraq, which is basically push the Sunnis out. And all of that's pretty much happened, regardless of whether we should have gone into Iraq or not. I'm not even getting into that. But the Vatican was right, and they're still right about that, because they understand that these issues are more than just geopolitical chess pieces. They are laden with tribal and religious and ethnic conflicts that aren't going to go away. And so we kind of drove ourselves into a blind gulch.
Oh, I agree with that. And I think it's very obvious today, some of the fallout of that. As an example, if we look at Egypt, Egypt's actually a fascinating story, because the Muslim Brotherhood ended up taking over there. It seemed like this administration was part of a driving force to make that happen. Then the people came up themselves and changed that government. But you have seen clear attacks and affronts against Catholics, Christians, the Copts, the Jewish people, other peoples who were, and in fact, it's kind of been a war amongst the different sects of Islam as well. But it's a very clear example that there's always someone waiting to take it out on the other religion, for lack of a better term. And I think the church has enough experience and has seen this happening for so many thousands of years that I think in their minds it's predictable, and we should maybe pay attention to what they're saying in these issues.
Well, we should. It's kind of incredible if the U.S. government would continue to back a defunct regime in Egypt, which is based around the Muslim Brotherhood. When we got a free pass, the army came back in and kicked them out. Why don't we just say, let things evolve as they're going to evolve? And the Pope made a comment about Syria. I think it's very important. That he said, basically, we have to seek a new definition of citizenship in these Middle East countries that's inclusive of all minorities. And I would love to see the United States pick up on that. And that resonates with our foreign policy, that we can say, look, no aid, no support, no nothing until you come up with a concept of sovereignty and citizenship which is inclusive of all the people that live in your borders. You just stop it right there. That in and of itself is enough of a platform to drive change in the Middle East.
I think you bring up a fabulous point, and this is particularly interesting because in the last handful of years, and I guess you can make the argument not just during Obama's administration, but during Bush and the terrorist war years, 8 years in total plus 5. I mean, it's a significant amount of turmoil around the world. And you have a problem in Europe and in the U.S., and I think they're fairly similar, right? In Europe and in the U.S., you actually have a strong division between those who are considered old-fashioned and conservative and religious, which I would think the Catholic Church would consider everybody who shows up in church on a Sunday morning, and versus the people who would look at religion as part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution. So there's two hidden questions in there. One is, what do you find, and have you seen any evidence in the recent meetings with the Pope that the influence of the Church in this sort of EU versus Russian divide is whether there's any impact or influence that they have that could really help to either settle, diffuse, or get the sides to think before overreacting? And then, if you would, turn that back in the U.S. and look at the president's position himself, who has, by his very own policies, made the faithful out to be part of the enemy within this country, as you could see, and Brett pointed out with his question on Obamacare.
Well, he certainly has, and that's one of the two big pillars of Pope Benedict's diplomacy that I try to write on the book. Is in addition to getting after the radical Islam problem and trying to urge that they come into concert with the 21st century, is he spoke against secularism in the West and what happens and what has happened to civilizations when they became so abjectly secular that they lost their principles and that religion becomes confined to something that happens inside the building and is attenuated from the average daily lives of people. Bad things happen, and we've seen all kinds of bad governments that evidence that, and I think we're seeing a very secular administration here in the United States. Hosanna versus Tabor was one example. This insurance mandate's another one. The refusal of people to really want to step up and push for principle in our foreign policy. These are bad things.
And would you compare those to what's been happening in the EU, and do you see some similarities in there between this current president's policies as well as the policies in the EU that, at least in my opinion, have made the European Union much weaker from a global position of strength, both in financial, in military power, but maybe most importantly as a moral authority?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, Brett, they're a generation ahead of us on the drive towards secularism, and now we're seeing another whole generation of people that is more interested in what they eat, what they wear, and where they go than what they stand for. And that's why we see the feckless response to what Russia's doing now. There's an inability of Europe to focus on their own security. They want us to provide it for them. I would love to see what would happen to Europe if we decided to say, well, we don't really care what language you speak. Go defend yourself. Because the fact is, they have had it too easy. We provide defense, and they get to get by without a moral conscience. And just last week, the chairman of Siemens is meeting with Putin while we're in the middle of trying to figure out how to bring sanctions on them for getting after Crimea, which, again, is a whole other can of worms about why Putin was so unable to do that. That goes back many years of foreign policy.
And I'm sure it didn't get past. I'm sorry, Brett. One last question. I'm sure it didn't get past you the irony that Putin has actually taken advantage of that obvious faith vacuum and now tried to present himself as the Eurasian savior of the Christian faith.
Yeah, and President Obama's weakness, which started out with pulling back the missile shield and negotiating the ICBM treaty, has just continued to enable Putin to realize that he can do what he wants. He can have his way with the Western world, and he's doing it. And even worse, to sit there and act like some kind of savior of Christians.
Well, we call that like the Machiavellian strategy, and I guess we're used to that here and so we should expect it from our adversaries as well. And I guess the sad thing in my mind is that with regards to Russia is it seemed like we were starting to work towards normalization of our relationships. And, of course, there are economic and business ties that we have. We've actually had joint military, not operations, but practice, I can't think of the word, but exercises and, things like that. And, of course, there were, the beginning of talks of, and to some extent, Russia was participating in NATO on certain things. And it seemed like it was a very quick about-face, and it seemed to me that it started the second we signed on to these new treaties and started pulling back on missile defense and things like that. And, it was very, very interesting. But if we can, Ambassador, and of course, folks, we were speaking with Ambassador Francis Rooney, who served at the Holy See, and I have some questions for you because you had discussed this as well. And in your book, the church has been, I guess, very influential and strong advocates in a lot of important issues, from human trafficking to dealing with the poor and poverty around the world, and human dignity and things of that nature. And so that's one thing I'd love to discuss briefly with you. But also, we've seen John Kerry, the Secretary of State, pushing for a solution to the ongoing negotiations with Israel and Palestine, the Palestinians, to come to some sort of an agreement where the two people could, live in peace side by side. And of course, that's that may be the most difficult task of all the things we ever discuss. But has the church changed their opinion on what's going on after seeing some of the things that have happened in the recent negotiations? And then, of course, we've seen some very interesting stuff coming out of the United States Congress with regards to human trafficking. Congressman Chris Smith has done great work for years, but in particularly with a lot of recent hearings. So I'd love to hear your comments on those two issues.
Well, okay, first of all, on trafficking, that's one of the real bright spots of the U.S. mission to the Holy See that we can be really proud of as a country. Our mission has led the development of anti-trafficking programs and actually drew the Holy See into visibility on the issue more than they had at the time. There's a nun over there who's incredible, Sister Eugenia, who is, I think she has a price on her head in Eastern Europe. She has been so vocal and so clear in trying to bring visibility against the trafficking generators and the users of trafficking that we've supported her quite a bit. And she's just a wonderful specimen and voice in this fight. And the State Department has backed our mission significantly in that effort. So it's a good thing. And the Vatican, of course, is all for it. They just don't always know what to do. That's where a secular mission like ours can come in and say, here's some things we can do. We can get the press in a host country to out some people who are traffickers. We can go to limit visas that are granted for young girls coming into, say, Japan or China or Brunei or somewhere. And we've had great success there. Now, in the Middle East, it's a little different. The Holy See is always going to be for a stability and territorial integrity in Palestine, in order to bring some kind of peace where their particular Christian settlements have a better chance of thriving. And that's always brought them into a little bit of conflict with the United States, because the United States has been a little reluctant to commit on the level of Palestinian sovereignty, as part of the basket of things that needs to be negotiated. Now, the Holy See would say they've got to renounce violence and recognize Israel as well. And they just don't seem to be able to get over that hump. But the position of the Holy See would be, we've got to have a legitimate Palestinian state where Nazareth, Bethlehem, places like that can be respected and live in peace.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And John and I had went to Israel. We spent the better part of 2.5 to 3 weeks there, and we went to all these wonderful places. And one thing you do learn is that in the period of time in certain holy sites that were controlled, when they weren't under Israeli control, it was very difficult. Well, it was almost impossible for Jews to go visit, but it was also very difficult for other religions to go visit some of these places. And I think when we look at that issue, I think it's very important that in this region of all places, which is so important to all religions, that all religions should be able to go and visit and participate in these most important sites. And I think that should be first and foremost. And of course, we want peace and people to live and go about their lives as well.
Yeah, Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict called for making Jerusalem an open city shared by all religions. And I think recently the Palestinians actually called for that. I think that's a great move forward.
Well, it would be very interesting to see how we make out on this. Well, Ambassador Francis Rooney, I've actually seen your book numerous times. Well, I have your book in my hand, but I've seen it in Barnes & Noble and some other bookstores. So if you could just, do you have a website where people can go check out more on what you're doing and find your book? Or
We do. It's called The Global Vatican, and we have a website, www.francisrooney.com, which gives some of the reviews and things about the book so you can get a feeling for what it's about.
Okay, fantastic. Well, again, it's great to speak with you, and of course, we always have an open invite for you to join us and discuss these issues and so many others. And so, again, thank you so much, folks. Ambassador Francis Rooney. The book is called Global Vatican, and of course, he was the ambassador for the United States at the Holy See. He's done great work, and as you hear from him, he's on the right side of many of these issues as well. So, again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brett. Have a great afternoon.
All right, you too.